The U.S. Department of Energy's Oak Ridge Reservation is the site of a vital national defense facility and a modern computational and scientific center. But over the years, parts of the reservation have been contaminated with radioactive and other hazardous waste. DOE has been busy cleaning up those affected areas, but much remains to be done. Citizen input is a valuable part of that effort, and DOE welcomes advice from the Oak Ridge Site-Specific Advisory Board, a citizens panel that provides independent advice and recommendations on DOE's cleanup of the Oak Ridge Reservation. The board provides input on a wide range of environmental cleanup operations underway at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, Y-12 National Security Complex, and the East Tennessee Technology Park. You can be part of this important work by attending the monthly meetings of the Oak Ridge Site-Specific Advisory Board. For more information, call or visit our website.
We'll start off with comments from our federal and state agency representatives. Dave Adler, do you have anything?
Just real briefly, thanks to everybody for coming out on a cold night. All the field work that EM is engaged in is proceeding smoothly still. We've pretty much torn heavily into the centrifuge complex. We're tearing down one of those buildings now. The big tall building that you see as you drive past the K-25 plant still has centrifuge removal activity taking place, but before too long we'll start tearing that building down. We're continuing to do the early stages of construction of the Outfall 200 project. We have just begun the initial phases of the U-233 processing campaign. We'll have some dignitaries down next week to help us announce that. That's about it. So I'll hand it over to Connie.
Thank you. I don't have any specific announcements to make, but I'll be more than happy to attempt to answer any questions if asked.
Christoph?
Good evening. Likewise, I don't have any comments or announcements. Thank you.
Okay. With that, Leon?
Tonight, Mr. Bill McMillan will make his presentation. We were trying to determine whether we want to read the short version or the long version of his bio, but instead I'm going to paraphrase it and add a few more comments to it. Mr. McMillan spent 30 years with DOE, but one of the things we may not know here tonight, some of us do, is Mr. McMillan is going to retire and leave us. So we have thought, instead of letting you retire the board, we're going to make you sign a lifetime retainer to where you've got to come back and constantly go through this suffrage all the time. But we would like to extend our appreciation. I know there's been a lot of long, boring meetings and probably been a troublesome time taking you away from your family at night and this and that, but we appreciate everything you've presented to the board through the years, and thank you and best wishes on your retirement. Yes, sir. Mr. McMillan.
So I appreciate the opportunity to be here again tonight. It's been, I don't know, 6 months or so since I was here last with you, and I forget what I was talking about then, but it wasn't MSRE. I brought a poster. I don't know if everybody can see it, if it's out of the way here, or if you can see it or not. I'll refer to this every now and then during the briefing. So this is intended to be an informational briefing. We're not really looking for recommendations from the group tonight. Of course, if you hear something that you want to make a recommendation on, that's fine, but we're here more as an information exchange about some things that we're doing, initiatives we're working on at the molten salt reactor facility. First of all, I know a lot of you, we've talked about MSRE in the past, but I know there's probably some new members here that haven't heard the background a little bit, so I thought I've got a few slides to go over the background and then get you to where the current state of this facility is, and then we'll talk about basically 3 initiatives that we're working on to improve the reliability of the operation there and to help preserve the facility until we get into D&D. Oh, I guess I got to turn this on. Okay. So molten salt reactor experiment was a facility built at ORNL, and it operated in the late 60s. Its purpose was to test different types of reactor fuels in a molten salt breeder reaction operation. And I'm not a reactor guy, so don't challenge me on what that really means, but that's what its purpose was. And they tested uranium-235 and uranium-233 as the primary isotopes in those 4 years of operation. Towards the end of that, they actually also tested a little bit of plutonium in the facility to see how that would react in the reactor operation. Utilized the fuel mixtures, utilized a fluoride salt, primarily uranium tetrafluoride, in a carrier salt of lithium fluorides and beryllium fluoride, I believe, or barium fluoride. Some fluoride salts were the carrier that remained molten and circulated through the reactor system. That salt today it remains at the facility. Once the reactor operation ceased, the reactor core and the recirculation system within it were all drained into drain tanks. I've got some photos of that in a few minutes. And then it was after all the system was drained, it was actually flushed with a flush salt to wash any uranium residues from that system as best it could be done. Today, the salt tanks, or the salt in the tanks, are in a frozen state. In other words, they cooled and solidified. It's in a frozen state, and its density is similar to that of concrete. It's a rock hard salt mixture. Contaminated with fission products. Now in the late 2000s, the reactor salts were defueled, so the uranium has been removed. There's still that trace of plutonium in it, but about 2.5 kilograms of uranium per tank is worst case. They actually measured the tank that had the first material. It was that is the highest, believed to be the highest concentration of uranium in it. After defueling, there's about 2.5 kilograms in that tank, and assuming the other tanks are less contaminated than that, which is a pretty well certain that based on the analysis. So less than 2.5 kilograms per tank, and there's 3 tanks. The radioactivity that comes from is a gamma radiation coming from the byproducts of cesium and strontium-90. About 99% of the radioactivity is from those short-lived radionuclides, relatively short-lived, strontium and cesium. But the hazardous material, it does constantly generate a little fluorine gas from the leftover fluoride salts due to the radiolysis of those salts. So that represents the biggest hazard what we deal with today. It's not the radioactivity or the radionuclide content, it's those fluorine gases that come from the salts. Location, MSRE is located, if you're familiar with the lab, this is Melton Valley Drive, which is kind of on the backside of what's the ridge? Melton Ridge? What the? Pine Ridge, behind Ornell proper. So it's on the back road. This is the high flux isotope reactor, which is a facility that's currently operated by the Office of Science. The solid waste burial grounds are in this area and east. And there's some waste storage facilities in SWASA 5 North and the shielded transfer tanks and so forth. The old homogeneous reactor experiment is there as well. So it's kind of out the way from the central campus area, located on the back road back there. So it's separate from the lab proper was the main point here. This is the same as what we have over here. Basically, this is a profile of the facility, ground level being right in this area right here. See the ground pointed to right there. So all the reactor cell was, hit the wrong button. So the reactor cell was in the center in a underground vault. It's got the shield plugs on top of it. The drain tank is adjacent to it at a little lower level, so obviously to let the material drain into it. And then you had various accessory types of facilities. Basically, the coolant recirculation system was on this side. Some of the off-gas filtering systems over here with the charcoal bed, and then HEPA filters, and the exhaust goes up the stack. So Currently, you see this. This was actually added after in the mid 2000s. This reactive gas removal system, and then most of these other facilities are all drained and decommissioned as well. So I'll refer back to this. That's why I've got the chart on the right. Some of the history and notable activities after the reactor was shut down. I mentioned all the salt was drained into the drain tanks, and the reactor loop was flushed with a flush salt, which is also drained into the flush tank. In 1994, though, well after the shutdown, the off gas, it was realized that a lot of the uranium was starting to collect in the off gas system, in the charcoal bed. So we had significant concentrations of fluorine and UF6 gases that led to the contamination in the auxiliary charcoal bed, which is this system over here. It's kind of I think I've got a picture of this too, but they're really stand pipes that the air circulated through these stand pipes. And so there was a cleanup action to clean up those charcoal beds to remove the contamination. That uranium was removed from the charcoal bed in the 1995 to 2000 timeframe, and that's when the reactive gas removal system was installed. You'll hear me talk a little bit about RGRS as we go through. That's the system that treats the gases to remove the fluorine and any residual uranium from the gases in the off-gas system. So that charcoal bed was cleaned up. The uranium that was removed is still managed in a canister at the site, stored as waste for eventual processing. And we're looking actually at using the U-233 process to go and capture the U-233 that's on that charcoal bed. 2001 through 2008, the planning for and the actual defueling activity was conducted. And as part of that, after defueling, they actually made an attempt, because the plan at the time was to remove the salt for disposal. And they actually attempted doing that. I'll come back to this in a little later in the briefing, but they actually attempted a salt transfer, and it was unsuccessful because they had problems with keeping it hot enough and moving it into other vessels without it solidifying and becoming problematic. So that process, the attempts to do that were abandoned at that time, and the salt continues to be stored in the drain tanks. So since then, we manage the off-gassing. We about every 6 months we do a purge of the tanks to treat the off gases from the accumulating fluorine in the tanks. We manage that and treat it through the RGRS system and discharge that through the stack system. And we conduct the general surveillance and maintenance of the facility. This is a photo of the tanks that we're talking about. We have the 2 drain tanks, FD1 and FD2, as well as the flush tanks. They're pretty much identical tanks. They're about 7 feet tall, 4 feet in diameter. They're down in the vault here. This is the bottom of this vault is about 38 feet below the floor inside the building. So it's quite a deep vault. The walls of the vault, you can see the walls in the diagram. They're about 3 feet thick, heavily reinforced concrete, and they're stainless steel lined. So it's a very rigid and robust vault that they're sitting in. The salt generates just a little bit. Here's the 2.6 times 10 to the minus 4 pounds per square inch atmospheric per hour of fluorine gas. And so it accumulates. What we do is we pump those tanks down every 6 months or so down to, I think, 8 PSI, and then backfill with argon to 12.5 PSI. And then it accumulates to about 13.5 in the 6-month time period when we pump it down again. So that maintains a negative pressure on those tanks to maintain a safety envelope to prevent releases into the building. So we held those tanks at a vacuum, to prevent any gas leakage into the facility, and we pump out every 6 months. We're starting to realize significant maintenance with the piping and so forth because of the fluorine contact with those pipes. So there's a good bit of maintenance that we have to do pretty much every time we go pump those down. So this is talking about that maintenance and the RGRS system operation. As I mentioned, it's used to remove the fluorine and uranium. We've had a good bit of failures of some of the valves and pressure transducers and so forth because of the corrosive nature of the fluorine. You can see the corrosion on this pipe here and this is a stainless steel or Hastelloy pipe it's probably not the Hastelloy, but it's stainless steel that had failed, has some corrosion with it. So we're having to constantly maintain a process to monitor and replace piping that's kind of been embrittled because of the fluorine over the years. So a couple of years ago, with all the issues with maintaining the MSRE, we started looking and thinking about what do we need to do to kind of make the operation a little more efficient. And so we'd had an engineering evaluation done, brought in a team of experts from outside of our organizations that could take a good hard look at the systems and make some recommendations. So 2 key recommendations I'll talk about tonight, because we're actually doing these, implementing measures to take care of these 2 recommendations. One is to install a continuous ventilation system to replace the RGRS system. As I mentioned, the fluorine gas is kind of the big heavy hitter for that, and the generation rate is very, very low. So, why are we letting it accumulate to a point where it's hazardous and difficult to handle and doing an active operation to pump it down? So the team recommended going to a continuous ventilation system, and that's something I'll talk about here in a couple of slides. But basically that would eliminate the large concentrations of fluorine gas that you get currently, and eliminate a lot of risk from the corroded components of the system. And then looking at the electrical systems, we're doing some things to improve the aging electrical systems. We had, a couple of years ago, we had some flooding in the basement from groundwater in seepage. The sump pumps down there failed. And we went to shut the power off and found there were leads coming into the building. We didn't know where they were coming from. And so it gave us a lot of, helped us realize the uncertainty we have with the power feeds into the facility. So what we're doing as part of this upgrade is really to replace the electrical system for all the significant components in the building with new feeds, and then we'll disconnect entirely the old system from it. So that's one of the things that we're doing here. It'll reduce the risk of failures like the sump pumps, and it'll prepare us for future decommissioning. So that engineering evaluation was completed, and we've taken it to heart and looking for things that we can do. So the 3 things I'll talk about based on the engineering evaluation: the continuous purge system. The layup is what we call the electrical upgrades. It also has to do with heating and ventilation and air conditioning and some office refurbishment. And then the in-situ decommissioning is something an idea we came up with a couple of years ago. I think in one of the briefings that Jay Mullis gave, he talked about that as an opportunity that we're looking into. So I'm going to bring you up to speed on where we are with that process as well. So talking about continuous purge, it's currently in the design phase. We are getting ready pretty close to starting the work on that in the field. Basically, it will replace the current RGRS system. Mentioned already that it'll streamline the removal of the gases and minimize any failure points. Helps, I think it's be less potential areas of exposure to workers, passive system maintenance. So it's basically a passive system that will be continuously operational. And we won't need to go into a big activity every 6 months to go through an active pump down with that. if you can take a look at the schematic here, this is basically a schematic of the fuel drain, of one of the fuel drain tanks. The risers in the middle is where the old thermal probes used to be located when they were tried to heat the system. But the important part is looking at the red and the blue lines up there. What our intent is with this, and I think the next slide will talk to it a little bit more, the intent is to input into those tanks a constant flow of nitrogen. And I know this is a big eye chart, but what I was just showing you was one of these tanks here. The blue line would be the feed of nitrogen into the tank, and there's a red line coming out that would be the off-gassing that nitrogen forces all the fluorine and headspace gases out with. Yeah, I know you can't see where that's running, but it's running up. It's a simple operation, runs out of the tank through, this is the nitrogen cylinders that would be used to input the nitrogen. The red line goes out through a monitoring system here that would tell us remotely that the system is operational and not, we would monitor it remotely to make sure it's operational. Also has sampling capabilities here in case we want to do periodic sampling of that off gas to confirm the low concentrations that we expect to have. And then it goes through that and straight on out the stack. Some of the advantages, it'll allow for the continuously ventilating the gas. The concentrations of fluorine are many orders of magnitude less than any regulatory requirements. So we won't need to be doing chemical trap treatment of it. Hands-off operation, and we'll replace the current discharge lines with lines that are compatible with the small concentrations of fluorine that would be present. We'll use stainless steel throughout the system. So that's the continuous ventilation. Talking about the layup project, this is a brief description of some of the things that we're addressing. The electrical distribution upgrade to replace the aging electrical systems. New sump pumps in the basement. I mentioned the failures of those sump pumps a couple of years ago. They were really outdated pumps. We had them repaired and put back in, but we know there's better pumps these days for doing that, so we'll replace the sump pump system in the basement to provide that increased reliability we're looking for. Minimizing the steam system. Currently, we buy steam from ORNL, and it's the same steam header that feeds the HIFER facility, which is a high mission priority for science. So in the wintertime when there might be a shortage of steam supplied for heat, guess who's the first one that doesn't get served steam? So we'll be upgrading the steam system to put its own boilers in place and provide the steam for heat, keeping the building heated so that the fire distribution system doesn't freeze, for example, and maintaining the people comfort that will be there in the offices. New fire alarm system and suppression systems. All this stuff is outdated, and it's really just bringing it all up to standards of today. Remote monitoring system, I mentioned, we'll monitor all the equipment, the blowers, the ventilation system, the fire protection system, all that will be able to be remotely monitored without having people there to actually go inspect everything every day. So that's basically what the layup project is doing. It's basically upgrading all the infrastructure in the facility. There's also several offices there that we'll be utilizing for ongoing, missions at ORNL, a cleanup mission at ORNL. So we'll be upgrading some of those offices with new electrical and heat and ventilating there in those offices as well as part of this project. Now switching to the ISD initiative, the in-situ decommissioning. Think of in-situ decommissioning, a lot of the synonym is entombment. We started looking at this a couple of years ago, but back when the CERCLA decision documents were developed in the late 1990s, we had basically two decision documents. This 1996 action memorandum was done to address the contamination, the migration of the uranium into the charcoal beds, and it was what was put together to initiate the action to clean out those, to clean out the charcoal beds. 1998 was a record of decision for the D&D activity. At the time that was developed, even though entombment was a recognized decommissioning option by the NRC in the late 70s, we didn't really have much experience with it at that point in time. So the in situ decommissioning options, although mentioned in the ROD, were not really addressed and analyzed like they would be today. So recognizing that, we decided we would at least see if that's worth analyzing today. And so a couple of years ago, we put together an initiative to, at least from a conceptual standpoint, do a feasibility as to whether it's something for us to go tackle and analyze in more detail. So we initiated a study. We used experts from Savannah River National Laboratory. Savannah River has a lot of experience with in situ decommissioning with P and R reactor and the can't remember what Hector stands for, but there's a reactor acronym called Hector down there that they performed in situ decommissioning on. They have experts down there that have designed and studied different grout combinations and formulas to perfect the grouts in the different types of environment and make them long-lived. So they've done a lot of study, and we, with EMs, them being some of the EM experts on decommissioning activities, we utilize them to help us see if this was even a feasible concept for us to evaluate for MSRE. So we looked at what's been done at other DOE sites as well as what's been done at ORNL. There's been a couple of actions at ORNL in the late 90s, early 2000s, like the gunite tanks, where some tanks were closed with grouting processes. But I mentioned Savannah River's reactors. Hanford has done a lot of in situ decommissioning. I think Idaho as well. So we evaluated and read some of the reports and studies that were done from other sites. We established some evaluation criteria around this conceptual analysis. You know, how implementable is it here? Will it be protective, or do we think it will be protective of human health and environment? Looked at some of the costs of doing it and then what might be future land use controls if it were implemented here. We also incorporated regulators into that action. After we completed our analysis, we provided briefings to to EPA and TDEC, and we actually put a workshop together that involved the regulators down at Savannah River site to talk with the experts down there that had done this, and even meet with the South Carolina regulators on a one-on-one without us in the room to talk about what issues they may want to share and be concerned, that were concerns that the regulators in South Carolina had. So having completed this conceptual study, we said the next step then, if, you know, and this was a successful study, obviously we believe it's something to continue looking at here. So our next step is to conduct a further evaluation that would be in the form of a revised feasibility study in the CERCLA process, which would go through the thorough analysis. It'll go through a lot of analysis leading to a potential revision of the record of decision. So here's what it would look like if we were to do in situ decommissioning. It would consist of grouting and how much grouting it would be. Basically, you know, the options would range from everything below grade, or it could be just the tank, just the reactors, tank and reactor, any combination of those below grade structures. We would look at doing in situ decommissioning on. Of course, the superstructure over it and all the support systems would still come down as planned. We wouldn't be doing like Savannah River's done with the reactors there, where the whole thing is just a big monolith sitting up out on the landscape. Primarily be below grade in situ decommissioning with a slab over the top of it when it would be done. We're entering the planning process for that right now, where we're looking at what gaps do we need to understand from a data standpoint, where do we need to go collect information about the facility, do we need to sample the salts in the tanks to get real-time data for that salt and content in it, how much NDA do we need to do, what kind of piping do we need to remove or not, and things like that. So we're looking at where those data gaps are that we need to go fill, and the planning process will also conclude with establishing data quality objectives for any sampling results that we'll use, and actually I think it goes all the way through preparing a sampling analysis plan. That plan and doing the sampling, doing the actual work of the feasibility study is the next phase. This is phase 1 to get the planning done. Phase 2 would be where we actually go out and gather the data and start analyzing things and performing the models of the groundwater and things like that we would need to do. I mentioned identify and locate the data. Consider any potential supplementary treatment options. Obviously, as long as there's the high dose fields from the strontium and cesium for the next 300 years or so, there's still a fluorine gas generation that's going on, although it should be going down as the radiolysis, as the decay of the strontium and cesium occurs over a couple of hundred years. Whether there's supplementary treatment options, getter materials, or passive treatment of those off gases is necessary to incorporate into the plan. So the planning process is looking at all that. The update of the feasibility study would provide the thorough investigation to address those options, which options, how much of the facility would be grouted or not. What are the modeling? We would do modeling to evaluate the long-term impacts, similar to what's done in a performance assessment if you were a disposal facility. Looking out, models run, I think, for 1,000 years to understand as the system sits there, what is the release capability of it. Use of a getter material to capture fluorine if necessary. What types of grout materials would be used. Some of the things that Savannah River's developed are self-healing grouts, that if they crack, they basically heal themselves. 1,500-year lifespan grouts, water repellent grouts, those kinds of things would all be considered as what would be the best type of grout to use for this situation. And then what kind of monitoring systems and long-term stewardship actions would we need to incorporate into our plan. Basically, using the drain tank cells as an example, I think the vision would be that you basically fill, you remove whatever extraneous piping that you would need to remove, but you basically would fill this whole interior area with grout and seal it all in place. So long-term maintenance and monitoring, site access controls, a lot of this, we already have site access controls planned for the reservation as a whole, especially in this area of the reservation. So what additional site access controls would need to be recognized for this? Long-term surveillance and maintenance, groundwater monitoring around the immediate facility to make sure that if there were a release, it would be rapidly detected and we could go do something about it. Air monitoring of any emissions coming out of it, fluorine gas that's generated or whatever. And then land use controls, deed restrictions, constant presence, whatever that is. And that's probably incorporated into the existing land use control plan that we have. So anyway, that's it. A lot of stuff going on. It's kind of an exciting time, but those 3 major activities are underway. And, to do this feasibility study is going to take probably a good 3 years to get it all done by the time it's all said and done. So it's not something we'll see the results of tomorrow, but it is something that we think has a great benefit for the cleanup mission here in Oak Ridge if we can improve. Because it is with the high dose fields today, it'd be a highly hazardous job to go out and do that. You saw the picture of the tanks down in the cell with all the interferences. Putting people down in there in a 1,000 R/hour field is kind of very hazardous to do. So that's the benefit.
Thank you, Bill. I'd
Okay.
like to open the floor to board members for questions. Miss Harriet.
Bill, my question is, at this point in time, how many people are involved in watching out for MSRE?
You know, there's a staff there in the building. There's probably 60 or 80 people that are currently in the building working primarily on MSRE as their primary function. So it's a pretty heavy operation today.
And that same 60 do the 6-month checks?
Yeah.
You don't bring in?
No, we
more?
don't bring in other people.
Thank you.
Mr. Fred?
Yeah, do you have an estimate of the ongoing maintenance costs to keep this going? And my second question is, you mentioned 3 years of feasibility studies. Do we have an idea when actual D&D will be completed on this?
Let me take the second question first because that's on my mind. D&D schedule for MSRE is in the late 2020s timeframe. You know, we're working primarily in the central campus for cleanup first, so that's getting the highest priority because of mission needs for the Office of Science. But MSRE is in the late 20s or early 30s. Second question, the other question was you'll have to repeat it again. My memory's short.
Do you have an idea of what the ongoing current maintenance costs are?
Yeah. You know, that cost is buried in a budget for surveillance and maintenance that's running around $30 million lab-wide. So I think the MSRE is a relatively significant part of that. I would put it in the $10 million range just for MSRE. You know, I wouldn't swear to it, but that's the neighborhood.
Mr. Bill?
Yep.
I want to thank everybody for the cards and everything while I've been out, so I appreciate everything. Okay, after the entombment, you mentioned gases being, would they be monitored even after entombment?
They would be. You know, I mentioned air monitoring at the site. I would think that, for example, with the tanks, there would be some kind of off-gas system. It could be either powered or passive, but there would be monitoring of what's coming out of that until it's basically gone.
For 200 or 300 years.
Well, or if we see that there's nothing coming out, then you could scale back on it. So, yeah.
Any other questions from the board? Okay, thank you. And we'll open the floor to the public. If anyone has a question, we'd ask that you please use the microphone. No? Okay.
I'm Jim Rushton. I was the project manager at MSRE from '94 to 2000, and good presentation.
Thank you.
That was a trying time.
I bet it was.
The sump pumps you mentioned, as I recall, the water table is fairly high at that facility.
It's around.
And so
this level.
Yeah, it's above the drain tank level. And so those sump pumps dewater the site and keep water from coming into all of those cells and enclosures. How do you address that in entombment?
So that's where you would use the grouts that would repel be hydrophobic. And that's been demonstrated. In fact, the R reactor at Savannah River is a perfect example. Our reactor was built in a swamp, and they had a dewatering system for that whole reactor facility. But the grouts that they've used in that facility were actually applied in a flooded basement area. And so they applied them wet, and they repel the water out today. So they're keeping the water out from the interior structures of this. So we would do something similar to that. I don't think we would have to maintain an active pumping system. At least that's not the vision if we if we grouted the entire facility. It's using those specialized grouts is what the plan would be.
Okay. My other question was there were a number of different campaigns, as you mentioned, to remove the U-233 fuel. I mean, some had migrated to different locations. With all the removals, what fraction of the U-233 has actually been removed? Has that material balance been closed?
Yeah, 98% is what the analysis shows was removed. I forget what the actual numbers of grams were, kilograms in the operation, but the NDA data indicated that 98% was removed.
Now that's from the drain tanks.
That's from the system, right.
But there was, I'm not sure all of the material was removed from the charcoal beds, and then there were other questions about whether some material had migrated into the reactor space. We were unable to make any measurements because of the heavy shielding there as well. Yeah. So the question is how. Yeah. So the question I would have is, and I guess this goes to your NDA measurements that you're planning in the feasibility study.
That will be evaluated.
Is the uranium that has been taken out is all sitting at the laboratory.
Yeah.
And so they're,
So the uranium that was removed was captured in NAF traps, sodium fluoride traps. Those traps have been relocated over to the U-233 building at Building 3019, and they're stored there. They're going to be treated as part of the U-233 project and disposed in the next 4 to 5 years. So that's where the majority of the uranium is. The uranium of the charcoal that was removed from the charcoal beds to recover the uranium that had migrated over there is still in MSRE, stored in a canister, so big, and that will also be taken over and processed as part of that U-233 campaign. So that's the plan for that.
A recommendation I would have would be to assign someone to do an accounting of what you find in all of those traps, and see whether you really have removed all of the U-233 or whether there's some other surprises in MSRE, because we found quite a few when we confronted it in 1994.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Christoph?
Yes, I have a few questions. Did you mention the reactor at Savannah River site that there was a special grout used over there to grout the basement? Was that any material, radioactive material, left in that basement?
Yes, the reactor core was still there. Residuals in the pumping systems was still there. They didn't clean all that out.
Okay. Thank you. Before I forget here, Bill did not get the credit for his great job on the site return plan. For a while, Bill was a manager, over the site return plan and did a great job on it.
Well, thank you.
And I have another question here. You also mentioned that if that salt will be entombed, that there will be some groundwater monitoring and any corrective actions. So my question would be, what kind of corrective actions can be done if there will be something detected migrating from that grout?
So I think those would be installing pumping systems. We'll have monitoring wells that are there to monitor that. And so if we found there was some migration out of the facility, I think we would be obliged to put in some pumping wells that would treat that. In 300 years, if the grout's a 1,500-year grout and the cesium and strontium decay away, 10 half-lives is about 300 years worth of age. Basically you're left with a hunk of concrete in the ground with some residuals. The uranium and plutonium's not going away, but a number of kilograms. The plutonium is about a kilogram. The uranium in the tanks is about 7.5, 8 kilograms or less. So you'd be left with that grouted into a big concrete piece of hunk of concrete. So The likelihood of a lot of escape is probably very, very minimal, but if it were, I think we would have to look as part of the long-term stewardship program on ways of pumping it and addressing that.
Thank you.
That would be evaluated, obviously.
Last call for comments or questions. Okay. We thank you, Bill,
Sure.
for your presentation.
Okay.
And we'd like to open the public comment period.
The public comment period is now open. Luther Gibson.
Good evening. I'm Luther Gibson. I was a member of the board from 1999 until 2005 and board chair in FY 2001 and 2002. I worked over 40 years as a DOE prime contractor employee at Paducah, ATTP, Y12, and also performed or managed actual work at Portsmouth, Fernald, Rocky Flats, and Savannah River. So I know a little bit about the DOE complex. My first point tonight is that on July 2nd, 2019, the Environmental Management Consolidated Business Center posted an announcement that DOE intended to issue a draft request for proposal within 15 to 60 days for the next Oak Ridge Reservation cleanup contract. It has now been 134 days, and that stale announcement remains in place as the latest public news. Switching gears, one of the things that I found interesting is to look back at previous SSAB meetings held on this day in a previous year. I do have to refresh my memory with the minutes usually. There is some people who have a mental disorder where they can remember every day of their life, but I'm not one of those. Anyhow, on November 13th, 2002, do you know who the presenter was? It was Connie Jones. She presented on an EPA sampling project done in the Scarborough community. The deputy designated federal official at the time was Gerald Boyd. And Dave failed to fall into a trap I was going to have. He actually made 3 announcements tonight. At that meeting, Mr. Boyd made 8 announcements. And in one of them, he said that DOE is always striving to better improve communication with stakeholders in the community. And he offered a suggestion to sponsor a workshop that goes into the technical details of the life cycle baseline. Such an offer does appear to reflect a different policy on sharing information than that which exists today. And then finally, at that same meeting, there were actually 7 committee reports. Imagine that. There was environmental restoration, stewardship, waste management, and the executive committees, as well as board process, environmental safety and health, and the Scarborough sampling report ad hoc committees. And in addition, there was a staff report on public outreach. That functioned at the time cycled between being a committee and a staff assignment for several years. There may not be as many separate activities occurring today, but there certainly is more than one each month. I'd like to remind you of that. Thank you.
Your name and keep your comment to 3 minutes.
I think that's Jim.
Oh, I'm really sorry.
Okay.
Okay. Are there any other members of the public who want to comment? Okay. As a Citizens Advisory Board to the Department of Energy on Environmental Cleanup, we encourage the community to attend and participate in our meetings. If you are unable to attend, you may send questions and comments to the address shown. Appropriate submissions will be read during the public comment period of any Oak Ridge Site-specific advisory board meeting and will be given the same consideration as those given in person. Meeting schedules and ways to communicate with the board can be obtained by calling 865-241-4583 or by visiting our website.
Thank you, Ms. Avi. At this time, I'd like to call for additions to the agenda. Can I get a motion to approve the agenda?
Second.
All those in favor signify by raising your right hand. All those opposed? Motion carries. Our next meeting will be Wednesday, February the 12th. That's our next board meeting. And the presentation will be on processing of uranium-233 material by Mr. Bolin, with the issue group caring for this issue being Browning, Keebler, Perez, Samaras, and Shields. This ends the presentation portion of the meeting. Presenters and subject matter experts may depart at your leisure. Thank you. Okay, Ms. Bonnie, you're up.
They all can leave now.
Just a minute.
Get the riffraff out of here.
Okay, on to more board business. In your packet, there are two sets of meeting minutes, one from September 11th and one from October 9th. We're doing them both because September 11th, we're not ready to vote on the last time. So do I have, if you've had time to look over them, could I get a motion to approve the September 11th?
Second.
Okay. Everybody in favor of approval of the September 11th, raise your right hand. All those opposed? Okay, now on to the October 9th meeting minutes. Have a motion to approve. In a second. All in favor? Raise your right hand. All opposed?
You didn't raise your hand.
I did.
I thought you abstained or something here.
So they are approved. Thank you.
Okay. So next up, we have a couple of emotions that came from the Enviro Management SSAB Chairs meeting, which was held out in Idaho a couple weeks ago. For those of you that are new to the board, the Chairs Group meets twice a year to provide site-specific updates, to receive updates from DOE-EM, and consider recommendations as a collective group for DOE-EM to consider in support of environmental management cleanup efforts across facilities. And the meeting is really designed to have each site group learn a bit more about what's happening across the complex so that there's a better understanding of what the collective challenges are, and help with, I think, help folks really kind of think about the prioritization of some of that work. So in this past meeting, there were two recommendations that came forward. Did everyone have a chance to take a look at those before the meeting tonight? Yes.
Can you summarize those in about 50 words?
50 words or less. Well, I brought my trip report, which is not 50 words or less. I'm going to have to get way more succinct at this. But at a very high level, the first recommendation is about the budget, which, as you know, we do a recommendation every year. And really the ask from the boards was that DOE engage with local boards earlier to share information so that they may make a more informed recommendation as it relates to the budget for their sites. There was a request for some additional information relative to prioritization as well as a part of that recommendation. Again, very high level, something that we've talked about, and I think something that, as we know, this last year with a bit of a delay with some of the budget recommendation information, it made it a little bit harder for us to do our recommendation. That's my high level Reader Digest version.
Is there something DOE can do in that regard?
It's a request and a recommendation that we get the information earlier to make better decisions.
The issue we have is our hands are usually tied by headquarters. So by y'all making this recommendation, it might help headquarters loosen that information up and get it to us so that we could then present it to you.
How much they're going to get until headquarters tells them how much they're going to get. So therefore, they can't give it to us until headquarters gets off their you-know-what.
So what I was looking for, something to rattle headquarters
yes.
trees. Okay. 3 words.
To us. Get it to us.
Well, in the past, we've always done our budget meeting in March. That was when I first started with the board. And every single year, it's kind of been put out a little bit further. And then this particular year, it was supposed to happen in May. And then we got another, we had to hold. And so then we had to rush it in June.
other questions or comments? Anyone opposed to trying to get the information earlier?
No, we're not opposed.
I move to approve the motion.
Wonderful. Can I get a second?
Second.
All those in favor signify by raising your right hand. All those opposed? Anyone abstain? Motion carries. The second recommendation is about the disposition and transport of nuclear materials. This one, there was a fair amount of conversation about this specific recommendation, but really the ask from the boards were to prioritize the development of final disposition sites so that there is that goal of reducing the interim storage footprint at each of the sites, to specify waste acceptance criteria for all forms of waste and spent nuclear fuel in a manner that will allow all sites to proceed with waste processing, and to continue to insist on a compliant budget to do those things, while also continuing to think about how we create a transportation program for safe and uneventful shipment of all waste materials. This recommendation came on the heels of a presentation from a gentleman, Ken, let me find his last name, Ken Niles, who is the Assistant Director of the Oregon DOE Office of Nuclear Safety and Energy Emergency Preparedness organization, and he gave a talk that was really focused on transportation itself of those materials and the efforts that go into that safe transport. Super informative, and actually did play a role into some discussion about this recommendation and the finalization of it for consideration. Questions?
Hey, Shel, from my understanding, DOE currently has a fairly robust transportation program. And as far as an uneventful shipment, I mean, you know, once that stuff gets on the road, that's basically out of DOE's hand. If somebody or some institution wants to create an incident, they will. And no matter how robust your program is, you know, that you can't have 100% compliance. I'm sorry, therefore, I disagree with that last bullet. I mean, I know there's certain things that when there's certain shipments that go out and there's enough, I'm not going to say.
The U.S. Department of Energy's Oak Ridge Reservation is the site of a vital national defense facility and a modern computational and scientific center. But over the years, parts of the reservation have been contaminated with radioactive and other hazardous waste. DOE has been busy cleaning up those affected areas, but much remains to be done. Citizen input is a valuable part of that effort, and DOE welcomes advice from the Oak Ridge Site-Specific Advisory Board, a citizens panel that provides independent advice and recommendations on DOE's cleanup of the Oak Ridge Reservation. The board provides input on a wide range of environmental cleanup operations underway at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, Y-12 National Security Complex, and the East Tennessee Technology Park. You can be part of this important work by attending the monthly meetings of the Oak Ridge Site-Specific Advisory Board. For more information, call or visit our website.